the BDD experience, we're just going to go through a quick little thing, and we'll just see whether you want to interact or whether you just like to do what you will on a BDD experience. And just to start out with this, as I mentioned, context is everything. Everything exists in a context, and everything is always true in some context. So I apply that to ATD, BDD. What you use it for, if you're in the insurance and financial industry, it's a thing you ought to be doing. If you're really in some highly technical thing where you're displaying videos or something like that, it's still important, but of much less use. So here's my rule. In fact, this applies to TDD as well. No code goes in until the test goes on. And as I mentioned, there's the triad: the developer, the tester, and the customer, who are all responsible for quality. So I have a couple of different definitions. Acceptance criteria that are general ideas of whether a story is working, or acceptance tests that are specific tests that pass or fail. If we're doing the calculator, acceptance criteria for a calculator: when I add two numbers, the sum must be correct. Acceptance test for a calculator: when I add 2 plus 2, I get 4. Now, that's an absolute test, but it also clears up some ambiguities, i.e., it says, well, 2 plus 2 is 4 and not 2, 2, or not 1, 0, because we're really in base 4 rather than base 10, something like that. So, specific tests that either pass or fail. And they are always implementation independent. It doesn't matter whether we're programming in Java or in JavaScript or in assembly, the acceptance tests are still the same because they represent the visible external behavior. So now, we're going to try something out. Input a temperature in Celsius, output in Fahrenheit. So let me go back to here and just put in the chat. If I am inputting a temperature in Celsius and outputting a temperature in Fahrenheit, what test should I run to make sure that this operation works? And you can just chat away. Just put something in chat. And I'll do my first one. So 0 degrees Celsius should wind up to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. What else should we have?
I guess we should have something validating the format, like for example, if I write it in letters, or if I input or not the symbol, or if I input very large numbers.
Okay. Oh man. So if we type in, all right. Cool. You're already thinking. And now, are you a developer or are you a tester?
At the moment, I'm a project manager, but I've been a developer.
Okay. So you already think about the requirements ahead of time. Excellent. So here's the thing: is we could so we have a numerics. It's got to be numerics. It's got to be within a range. It's got to have a measurement on it, and so forth. Oh, let me ask this: since you're if whatever it is, if I type 1 Celsius, I get 33.8 Fahrenheit.
Yeah. Okay.
How many decimal digits should we have?
Yeah. That's a difficult part. Yeah, we need to define that.
To define it, and we need to define it, and it is a customer decision to define it, not the developer's decision to define it. This is the key. So let me switch back to this. So we've got a given, when, then. Given something in Celsius, when we compute something in Fahrenheit, then we get something. And so we can just make up a table of those things. 2 digits of precision. Yeah, we're below absolute zero, so we get an error. Thank you. I had a lower maximum than you did, but we recognize that there should be a maximum with something like that. This is the discussion we have with the triad prior to the implementation. And part of the reason is, for the developer, you now see all of the, I'll call it the edge cases and what the issue should be. It isn't like the tester should come back and go, oh, how about, oh, we have a maximum. And the developer goes, what? What are we talking about? So we want to come up with these things first. Now, it's given, when, then. It's our sequence of operations in all of our scenarios. Given the input, when we can do a computation, then. It's a business rule. So given the Celsius is value C, when we convert it to Fahrenheit, which is a trigger, then we assert the value is the value in F. Given, when, then. Input, process, output. So now, what's the difference between the scenario, which is what we want to, the way the system should work, and a test? Well, a test still has a given, when, and then, except in the then, we actually do our assertion. We say the value is what we expected. And of course, if the check fails, the implementation is wrong. So I give 2 alternatives. The expected system state in the output is the behavior that we want from the system. So the expected behavior drives development, and we get behavior-driven development. If we focus on the fact that we're going to test that the behavior is acceptable, then acceptance test drive development, and we get acceptance test-driven development. So behavior-driven development, acceptance test-driven development ultimately are the same thing. One concentrates on the behavior, which we're going to test, and the other concentrates on the test of the behavior, but in reality, the end product is the same. The only difference between these two, as I've had some people come in, is behavior-driven development was actually, the term came from somebody in Great Britain, and acceptance test-driven development, the term came from an American. And so as one person said, I see, it's British-driven development and American test-driven development. So that's the main difference. So how are we going to implement this? Well, with a BDD, ATDD framework. We have our table here. And the triad has agreed that this is the way the system should work. And now we run it. And we see that there's an error, that somebody messed up on, oh, the round up or the round down. Oh, we forgot to specify that. Next time we'll catch that. And so we may learn something from a failing test, or it may simply be a bad implementation. This happens to be FIT, which is an old system that was developed in the early part of this millennium. Well, you still can run FIT. Nobody maintains it because it works. And now it's part of Fitness, which is a wiki-based version. But anyway, this is a given when then in the fit terms. But nowadays, many people are using Cucumber or Spec Flow, whose name depends whether you're doing C sharp or anything else.
Yeah.
And now we have given Celsius as Celsius. When we convert it, the temperature is Fahrenheit. And we simply list all of those values. That's one way of specifying a test in Cucumber. Given when then. There's another shorter way of doing it, which you probably don't see in many places. And that is just this. Input is Celsius, output is Fahrenheit. So we have, there's our Celsius, our Fahrenheit, and you just put some notes on it. There, we have just completed our first scenario, which is a test. Developer takes it, implements the test, implements the production code, and we've gotten one part of a story done.
Yeah. Can I interrupt a little bit?
Be my guest.
About this interaction between people, usually I usually work with it's closed scope projects, but we use Scrum inside. So we start with these rough requirements, and then we are heading to development. And what I know about Scrum is we are going to specify a little bit more. We're going to have a conversation. So we have this story that we write, and then we can write acceptance criteria on that story. And then in the end, we can, and then sometimes we use unit tests and all that, and then we pass to the key quality assurance team or person to test to test it in other ways, like exploratory testing.
Right.
But I don't have this. I'm not very used to using all of this in a flow way, in some streamlined way when we don't repeat steps. So what would be the ideal interaction for you when we start from the rough requirement until we get it into maybe not in production, but tested, ready for production?
Okay, actually, let's talk about it a moment, and I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so that you can actually see my face, because many of this stuff I talk with my hands, and if you don't see my hands, yeah, half of the meaning all goes away. Okay, so good. We're a small group, so we don't have to have a pre everything in this work. In fact, you don't even know what's in this workshop, so you might if I don't show it to y'all. Anyway, so here's the way that I typically suggest that it works. You come up with a story. The product owner comes up with maybe an acceptance criteria. And it's got to be a better one than acceptance criteria. The story must work. Wow. Okay. Or acceptance criteria for the temperature. The conversion must be correct. Okay. We got to get out of that. All right. We need, if you're doing a story, you got to get down into a little more depth. And so for the example of, say, just the temperature conversion, we're going to put that story on the board. And now I'll come back to when in the iterations you should be doing this. But the steps would be, we put the story on the board. In fact, before putting the story on the board, we're going to have a little bit of exploration of the story. We'll have a few minutes discussion and see whether we can come up with one single test, i.e. 0 to 32. And we go, yeah, okay. At least we have a test for it. We're not full, but at least we have a test for it, and we understand how we're probably going to test it. Not worrying about the details, minimums, maximums, and all of that stuff. Now we have what I call a testable requirement or testable story. And that's the T part in invest of that thing. So now we can actually then schedule that onto a backlog for a sprint. Now, when we pull that story off and we say, okay, now we're going to work on it because we got the capacity, we get the triad together and they work on detailing it, okay, to as much as possible. Every time you can put it one more detail, spend 1 minute putting one more detail in, you save 5 minutes of having to write up a defect card. Now, I'm not saying you're not going to discover things later on, but you could at least discover the things you think about and know about now. And maybe there are things like, well, I don't know whether we want to round up or round down to get to 2 digits. Okay, that's fine. We just put that and we know that's a known unknown. So now we create those tests. And now I separate things out into 3 separate things, 3 separate types of scenarios, if you will. And I'll show these a little more detail. There's one I call the business rule or calculation. That conversion is a calculation. It's a business rule. And it is the simplest possible thing to automate. Underlying there, you might have a method or a function. It might call a couple other functions, depending how you've broken things up. But you don't have to set up any data. You don't have to do anything. And for those environments, contexts, where you're mostly about business rules, man, getting all those business rules right is important. And developers shouldn't be making up the response to the calculation. The business is saying, I want 1 digit or 3 digits or 2 digits. Oh, or maybe I want an input that allows me to specify how many digits. Wow, okay. Now we have those tests, which actually now define what this method or function story should do. Now, developer, it's a unit test. In fact, most business rule tests are unit tests. And now you go, well, unit tests would roll the developer. And it's like, no, they're the same. It doesn't matter, because if it's specified from the outside, it is an acceptance test. Your system must work like that. If you wanted to break this thing up into 3 or 4 different methods, one of which calculated the formula, one of which did rounding, one of which checked the input, okay, you can write unit tests for all of those guys. But when you come at the end of the day, when you combine those methods, it must pass this acceptance test. Maybe you write one method, maybe you break it into 20. I don't care. But it must pass this acceptance test. Now we've got that guy done. So I consider that the most important of the, the most common of the tests, which is a business rule test. Now the second thing is what I call a domain test or domain term test. We just take that value. In fact, you implied it. That if I'm specifying an integrated, it must be 30 with a C on it. Okay, 30 with a Q on it is invalid. All right, and so we can now specify what are the valid values for domain term. And now that's a simple little thing. In fact, simplest possible test, and you run it against a constructor or a parsing mechanism or something. Once again, but it's externally visible. When I type something into a screen, it's going to give me an error. And I have now a sample of those. And then the third type of test is what I call the flow test. Because everything you're doing it is in a flow. And I'll give an example of that shortly. But basically, if I'm using my temperature in some other bigger flow, so I'm converting some report that's in Celsius to Fahrenheit, now I've got to construct a report that has a Celsius temperature in there. I then call my business rule for the conversion, and now I have an output report. Well, that's a bigger test, but you will have to run those tests, but that is a bigger thing to create. So, does that explain it so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So let me go back. In fact, we'll just let's see. We'll continue along here. We'll see where we go on this. In fact, that even gives a context for all of this stuff. So as I said, that temperature conversion is a business rule or calculation. It's stateless. We don't have to set up anything. We simply convert an input to an output. So now let's take a look at how these tests fit up into a context or a flow. And here's the way a flow works. Given some state, we need to set up something. When an action or event occurs, which is a trigger, then a new state or an output occurs. So we have a setup, a trigger, an assert, or we have some preconditions that have to be true, and then we reach our post conditions. Given, when, then. So here's a flow. In fact, just what I mentioned. Given a temperature setting is Fahrenheit, when a report is received that has Celsius temperatures in it, then the report gets sent out with the temperatures in Fahrenheit. So given, when, then. So if we look at a context for it, some system sends us a report that has temperatures in it. We go to some sort of configuration that says, should the output temperatures be in Celsius or Fahrenheit? If it says we want them in Fahrenheit, then we get an output report that has them in Fahrenheit. And this flow utilizes that business rule to do the conversion. And of course, you get into all these other issues. What if the temperature is out of range? Should the report show ERROR as error, or what should you do it? But you're in essence, that's now just little details. So we have a given a temperature setting. When a system sends a report, then our report comes out. So let's look at the flow here. If you look at a lot of BDD, ATDD books, they don't have many context diagrams. They might have a little flow diagram, but I always start before I get into details of how does this fit into the context and into the flow. So I've got a convert received report. First, I have to do a configuration. Do I want my outputs in Fahrenheit or Celsius? Then there's going to be a receiving report. Then there's going to be a converting of that report. Then there's going to be an outputting of that report. Now, is this one? So we got a given, when, then there. So given a configuration, when I get the report, then we output. Now those are teeny tiny little steps. If they were big steps, like the output might be, well, we're going to do PDF and HTML and also send an email, that may become a separate story. Same for receiving. We get it over the web, we get an email, what have you. That becomes a separate story. And then we have our tests, obviously, for each of those stories. But that shows us where our flow is, and we're going to use that temperature conversion in the convert part of the flow. So we have a context and we have a flow. alternatives. Now, this is called discovery, and there are a couple of ways you can discover things through, they've got example mapping, some people do, or I just do a little more informal. I go, well, what other scenarios are there? Well, in fact, you already mentioned one. What if the temperature is out of range? What if the temperature is missing? It's got Celsius, but nothing in it. What if the temperature is alphabetics, so forth and so on? You basically just sit there and do a brainstorming session on what are all the other possibilities. And then you decide whether you're going to deal with them or not deal with them. All right. I found that some people go, oh, well, we got to deal with them all. Well, that makes the story really big. Some people say, well, we got to deal with them all, but it's too much work. And so then you start to split stories up by different scenarios. So let's just do a quickie little thing here. Here's my suggestion. I'm presuming you are all tweeters. I'm not much of a tweet guy. I do it every now and then. So at least you're probably familiar with the context.
Yeah.
So, but here's my story. As a sender, I want to send tweets that appear in my followers' preferred language. My basic scenario, the tweet is translated. Given the sender speaks one language and the receiver speaks another, when the sender tweets a message, then the receiver sends the message in their language. So I'm just going to open this up, and I'll go back if you want to either speak it up or just type in the chat. And all you need to do is just give me a title of the scenario. What other possibilities are there? Any ideas? Speak or type, whichever you like. Writing in language unknown. Thank you. Oh man, we only send numbers to this. Okay. So we don't have to do any translation. Okay. Yep. So it's possible that we don't understand the language, or we may not have a translation for that language, ancient Latin, or something. Okay. Numbers with mixed letters. Oh, so there's sort of like some words that are mixed with letters. Ooh. Okay, what happens if a real user of the system breaks it? Okay. So suppose we've come up with our scenarios, we ran a test, and now somebody utilized it in a scenario we hadn't thought of. Oh, so now the question is, should we add another scenario? Yeah, why not? Okay. If we say it's a valid scenario, let's add it. If we say, no, it's an invalid scenario, then let's try and disable it from happening. So, a real user system, we'll call it a real user system doing something to break something is like an exploratory. We're letting our users be our exploratory. And the question is, should we eliminate or try and mitigate what happened? Or should we just simply, good idea, a good feature to add? All right, thank you. Okay. So now we've got our scenarios or alternate scenarios. So every one of those is going to be given us, and we'll come up with some of the details shortly. So we have a given when then here. So let's look at the flow. So under Twitter context, it sort of looks like this. We have somebody who's followed. that sends a tweet, and we have a follower that receives the tweet. And now there already exists something where both the follower and the follower are recorded in the enterprise database, and we're going to also record the tweet so that we can play it back later. Oh, then we can get into, probably we want to just record it in the original language as opposed to the languages that we converted it into. But that's already being done already. So really all we're talking about is the flow from somebody who's followed that sends a tweet, and did the follower receive it in the language? Given, when, then. So we both record. And now our then part's going to be the tweet. If this was our first time and we never did anything, well, maybe we also want to record the tweet. But chances are we have another scenario that already covers recording tweets. And we want to keep our scenarios simple. So we have register, we have our tweet settings, and deregister. There's a flow. What register is a Twitter user. Set up your settings, what language you're going to send your tweets in, and deregister. And then we have our tweet with our translation scenario. We receive the tweet, we translate it, we send it out to the followers, and then we also record the tweet. But that's a separate story that's already been implemented. We're just dealing with in fact, just the translation part. But that gives us our context of what we want for our flow. Given, when, then is what we're doing right now, that little part. And it breaks down to given, we receive it, when we translate it, then we send it. So now, here's a flow outline that we had before. Given the temperature setting is in Fahrenheit, we receive a report in Celsius, we send it out with the temperature in Fahrenheit. That's just an outline. But we really need to add values if we're going to write a test. If we don't have any values, we don't have anything to check. And if we don't have any values, nobody can go, well, that's not what we meant. So here's one with values, a scenario with values. And almost all of the time, you want to have data or values associated with your scenarios. So given the temperature setting is Fahrenheit, when it's received in Celsius, then, so it's received with 0 degrees or 100 degrees in Celsius, then the report is sent out with 212 degrees in Fahrenheit. So somewhere in the report was 100 Celsius, we do a translation and we send it out with 212. Now notice that's one of the instances of our business rule test. So now this is showing indirectly how that business rule is incorporated in a flow. This is the one with values. If you look online and look for cucumber tests and everything, you'll see a lot of these values in line. But there's another way of doing this, and that's with tables, i.e. step-def tables. So here it is, given the temperature setting is Fahrenheit. When a report is received containing 100 Celsius is the measure, then the report is sent with 212 Fahrenheit. Wow, that's a little detail. So some people simply use what I call the inline data, and some use tables in their data. These both are the same thing. But let me ask this. This may be too simple a thing. But does anybody have any objection to the table data versus, let's go back to the inline data? Does anybody have any objections at having these values in a table?
I think the table would be more useful if it had more instances, not just one test, but
a set of them. Yep.
A set of them.
And so what happens is more instances. The reason I prefer tables is it just now we have domain terms. We have a domain term called measure, whatever, which can be Fahrenheit or Celsius. We've specified our domain terms out separately from our English, from the given when thens. And if we have an additional value, all we have to do is add it to a table. Maybe in addition to measure Fahrenheit, we might have precision or number of digits, and we put 2 in there. Okay. Or anything else that revolves around temperature setting. And it's simply then you don't start to have a lot of things going horizontally with. I've seen scenarios that have 10 and 20 and 30 lines where things are set up. Here you simply have the same given with multiple values on just in the table. All right. So what we're going to do here, I want to send tweets that appear in my followers' preferred language. And we're just going to start with one follower. And I could share another screen, but we've got, thank you. Okay, everybody likes the tables. Okay, so I'm going to actually just type this into the chat. So given sender speaks and language, all right, pick a language. It has to be one you know how to translate, by the way.
Portuguese.
Oh, given the sender speaks Portuguese. Did I spell that correctly? Portuguese, sorry. Okay. And receiver speaks and give me a language of the you got to be able to translate. So give me
English would be easier.
English, good. Okay. When sender tweets and a message. Okay, give me something simple in Portuguese, and I apologize if we don't have to have perfect spelling, but go ahead. Give me just one word. Let's keep it simple. Obrigado. All right. Then receiver sees and what is obrigado? Thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the thank you. Okay. All right. We have just now created a flow test. We've given it data. We now have a test. Do we need to automate this? Well, we're at least going to run it manually. So we need to set up a follower that speaks Portuguese, a followed person that speaks English, and bingo. We'll make sure that the translation is correct. Okay. So far, so good in that?
Yep.
Okay. I could put that in Notepad, but then I have to keep switching what I'm sharing and everything, so it doesn't work quite as well. All right. Well, actually, see, I did different ones. Given the sender speaks American English and the follower speaks British English, when the sender tweets the behavior with without a U, then it's translated to with a U. Okay.
Yes. Actually, it's wrong, right? It should be acceptance criteria driven development.
Oh, very good. Oh man, you have just that. Now that becomes an interesting point here. How much we want to translate? But that's I like that. I'm gonna have to. I'll have to do that the next time. So we have given our another one is here's our 2 registered users, and now we're just slightly manipulating that so that we have Joe and Sam, and we send a message and it's received by the other person. And of course, then we can use that same registered users to say, given that Sam sends a message, did Joe receive it properly? So there's our scenarios for that. So then our last thing is business rules. Let's see, yeah, we got 15 minutes left. So the flow scenario is stateful. We have to create a tweet, and then we apply it. The business rule things are just inputs and outputs. So given some inputs, when a calculation is performed, then this is the output. So now there was our calculation. Given the input in Celsius, the output is in Fahrenheit. Given, when, then. So now the question is, for given, when, thens, this is just a note, is how many should we add? Should we just do the 6 that we've come up with, which for the testers, you'll note, including equivalence classes and something at the breakpoints. And so I always say there are 3 levels of detail in a scenario. Just enough to understand it, complete, which would include all the standard test checks a tester would do, equivalence classes and breakpoints, or combinations for extensive testing, i.e. the tester can go and try basically explore this business rule. Now, for something simple like this, maybe, the standard, but maybe if it's a critical business rule, you'll do extensive testing for it, okay? Like, we're not just going to go with 500.01 as an error. We're going to try 1,000,000 and see if that also gives an error, and 1,000,000,000 and see if that also gives an error. And you go, hey, that should work. Well, you're just exploring the business rule further and further. So that is what I call the combinations or exploratory. So now, at least this is probably, I'm going to call it the complete version. Maybe you just started with that to understand things, and then you started adding that to have all the complete. And of course, as we show, that business rule gets used in a flow. We have a report, we call the business rule in the translation, making an output. But then we also have domain term scenarios, valid values for the domain terms. So given a value, when we check it, then the value is invalid or valid. So here's our Celsius. 0 is a valid. 0, 1 is valid. But we said, we only want 2 decimal digits. 001 is not valid. And then, of course, our domain term would also take care of the ranges as well. So, in fact, the business rule would probably never be past an invalid Celsius value if we had the domain term checking as well. So now, a domain term scenario for a tweet or a business rule scenario for a tweet. So let's just do this once again. All right. So if we have a domain term, so it's going to be scenario is going to be domain term tweet. Okay. Valid tweet. Value valid. So Let's see. As an example here. Okay, that's a valid tweet. What would be an invalid tweet?
Something that wouldn't be written in any language, like for a typo, for example.
Okay, we'll assume that that's not valid in any language. Okay. And we could actually then just type these things, you know, ADS, no, not in any language. So we could, all right. Is no characters a valid tweet? Oh, including other oh yeah, so we could have characters not in a language. So I can't type. Oh, I guess those characters would be, but yeah, if I was in Portuguese, I can't. Sorry, I don't have a Portuguese keyboard here. So I don't know. Suppose an accented A. Is that? Do you have an accented?
Yeah.
You have an accented A, so that would be yes, a valid tweet.
Yeah.
I can't put it on top because my keyboard. But yeah. Okay. But you could say, okay, these are characters not in the language. Yeah, I know. Okay, thank you. Oh, good. Then I just can take that. Thank you. Okay. And then I can say yes. Cool. So that would be good. Perhaps, and I can't type this all out, but we'd have a no because it's too long. Okay. So now we could define a tweet and say these are valid or invalid. And since we know the language, we could say it's valid or invalid in Portuguese. Simple little thing. And the only thing that we're going to translate then, the translator has to worry about, is the fact that it already has a valid Portuguese sentence or phrase, and it doesn't have to do any more work. So we've actually, by putting the responsibility for domain term of Portuguese tweets, we've taken that out of our actual translator. So now let's do the scenario translate. And this is going to be a little more difficult. So I'm going to call P to E, in, out. And, oh, excuse me, not, I didn't mean that. I mean, in language, out language, in message, out message. Oh, in is Portuguese, out is ing. Come on. In is out is thank you. Okay. So here now we have a business rule scenario in translation. We don't need to test it out, actually receiving the tweet. This would be the calculation of what should we actually output there. Okay. Can you give me any more examples just give me one more, and you don't have to give me the full thing. Can you think of any other scenarios that we should test our business rule to make sure that it actually works? Okay, so let me just give you an example, not hearing anything, and I won't be able to test this out. Suppose that you typed in something. I know that this says thank you, but suppose that the output was thank you very, very much, very much, very much, and so forth. To win, it actually was output is greater than maximum tweet. Oh, we have a business rule that says we're trying to tweet something and our translation is too long. I'm glad we have this discussion. What should we do? What should the output tweet do? Break it into, I'll give you, okay, 5 minutes ago, thank you. What should the output be?
Maybe we could truncate it, so we should show up until the top maximum extension, and then stop it.
Okay, so we have a truncate's an option.
Yeah.
What else could we do? Oh, a countdown on characters. Oh, okay. So we're going to sort of be inputting, and we're going to tell the sender that when an output tweet is going to be too big. Okay, so we got a countdown. What's another? Oh, a new user story. Yeah, we could do that. That's when you go, okay, I don't know what the answer is. Let's put that off to new user story. Cool. Or perhaps I'll just give you one more possibilities. Break into 2 tweets. Okay. Wow. All right. And now we go back to our customer while our product owner is sitting there, and our product owner might say, yeah, and they're the ones who's going to make the decision. The developers are going to be sitting there going, yeah, that's going to be really tough. Okay. Or no, maybe not. And then, of course, our testers are going, I understand how we're going to test this. Okay. And so what we've done is taken a requirement. We've started to detail the requirement, seeing all of the possibilities. Okay. And coming up with a decision to either do it this way, do it that way, or put it off to a new user story for later discussion. So there you go. It looks like we're ending up. I'm going to stop my share so I can see everybody who's there. Any last questions? Okay. Well, if not, you can contact me on LinkedIn or just send me a note, ken@kenpugh.com. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks a lot, Ken.
You're welcome.